Good morning, AWS, and welcome to the AWS Morning Brief for Monday, November 25th. Strap in, this one's going to take some time as AWS has dumped an enormous number of service releases that apparently didn't fit into the reInvent keynotes in a week and a half. But first, this episode is sponsored by Influx Data. If you need a time series database, you might consider using Amazon TimeStream, except for the part where they announced it and then never bothered to release it. If you have problems today that you don't really want to trust to vaporware, then consider InfluxDB. It is the time series database used by grown-ups who need time series databases. To learn more, visit influxdata.com, and my thanks to them for their generous sponsorship of this ridiculous podcast. Now, what happened last week in AWS? A lot. Amazon Aurora MySQL 5.7 expands its list of supported features to improve performance and manageability. In order to be more like the existing database, it was touted as being already compatible with at launch. Right. Amazon Chime management APIs now allow you to manage chat rooms. You know, I've messaged a few hundred people on Chime by now, but I've been in maybe 3 Chime chat rooms. I'm sure that this matters to Amazon, though, the only other customer of Amazon Chime. Amazon Cognito now supports sign-in with Apple. This has everything to do with Apple's requirement that sign-in with Apple be supported in mobile apps by April of next year, because without it, apps are going to get booted from Apple's App Store. So without having this feature, no one is going to use Cognito for authentication in mobile apps. I'm not being particularly snarky about this because it is, in fact, a necessary change, but Cognito still needs to get better. Amazon Connect launches web and mobile chat for a true omni-channel contact center experience. So Amazon has announced an intercom competitor and has forgotten to market it other than a small release announcement. Is there perhaps a blog post that missed my feed somewhere? Or a keynote to a conference I forgot to attend? Or are they just figuring that this marketing tool will market itself? We'll find out. Amazon EBS Fast Snapshot Restore eliminates the need for pre-warming data into volumes created from snapshots. Little known fact, when you create an EBS volume from a snapshot, the data is lazy loaded from S3. So if you want that data to be performant, you're generally going to have to DD read the entire volume once you mount it. This solves that problem neatly. The counterpoint is that the pricing is sarcastically high. If you leave it enabled for one snapshot for 1 month in one availability zone, it'll cost you a little over $500. Amazon EC2 autoscaling now supports maximum instance lifetime. Slowly age out your instances. When the maximum lifetime is reached, the autoscaling group will replace it. I've got to say that maximum instance lifetime is better than the original proposed names of autoscaling group Iceflow or autoscaling group Logan's Run. It also keeps you having old instances from hanging out forever. Insert your own dark joke here. Amazon EC2 makes it easier for customers to discover and compare EC2 instance types. And it still doesn't have nearly as functional interface as the well-regarded EC2instances.info. Although I bet that the API that they've released makes generating third-party tools that are usable far more straightforward. Amazon EKS adds support for provisioning and managing Kubernetes worker nodes. There's no additional charge for this either, which is a really nice change, except for the part where you're still running Kubernetes. Amazon Lex now supports sentiment analysis and promptly segfaults on reading my newsletter and Twitter feed due to the miracle known as sarcasm. Amazon Route 53 now supports overlapping namespaces for private hosted zones. So you can have a different zone for company.com and dingus.company.com, which makes some database schema work I've been struggling with way easier. Amazon S3 replication time control for predictable replication time backed by an SLA. Amazon Transcribe now supports alternative transcriptions, which gives me a great idea. I would like to do that for various AWS keynote events, where I hear what they say, and instead I write down the subtext of what they're actually saying. It's kind of like my live tweet events, only a little bit more sarcastic. Announcing Amazon CloudWatch Service Lens. This ties together some CloudWatch metrics and logs in one place, along with X-Ray, which would be super handy if people used X-Ray, but it hasn't hit critical mass due to lack of service support on AWS's side. If everything doesn't support X-Ray, it's pretty much useless. Announcing updates to the Amazon EC2 Instance Metadata Service. This is a second metadata endpoint in EC2 instances, and in order to query it, you first have to do an HTTP put against it, get a token, and then use that token for a get. This is an interesting security upgrade, and it'll be valuable once you turn off the old instance metadata service, which AWS is currently scheduled to do on the 3rd of February. AWS Cost Explorer monthly forecasts now include support costs, which is a very useful feature indeed. But if you missed this announcement and glance at Cost Explorer right now, you might have a minor heart attack. AWS Ground Station is now available in the Middle East region, which is fascinating. That is, to my understanding, the first ground station location not in the United States, which opens and solves for a wide variety of regulatory hurdles. It turns out that the Federal Communications Commission, or FCC, has no sense of humor and presumably does not listen to this podcast. AWS Lambda now supports environment variables in the AWS China regions. I don't rightly understand how you could effectively use Lambda without environment variables until now, or why it took so many years for environment variables to work in those regions, but for better or worse, I don't do a whole lot of work in those regions to begin with. AWS Lambda now supports Node.js 12, Python 3.8, and Java 11. Time marches on and progress does, one way or another, come for us all, except for the poor folks still forced to write Java. AWS Marketplace now offers syndicated product reviews to make it look a lot more like Yelp. I look forward to reading poor reviews of excellent services as a hobby. If you want not to deal with crappy marketplace stories and instead use marketplaces effectively, consider talking to sponsor Manifold. That's right, Manifold understands how marketplaces work. They help take your API-first SaaS offering and go where customers are. Visit manifold.co/providers if that sounds like you. Again, that's manifold.co/providers. And my thanks to them for their continuing sponsorship of this ridiculous podcast. AWS X-Ray offers improved trace analysis and identification of service disruption, and all the while the AWS status page maintains its cheery green glow. Longer format resource IDs are now available in Amazon EC2. Wait, what year is it? Did I fall back into... Oh, in GovCloud. They dropped the in GovCloud part from the headline. That makes more sense. Announcing CloudTrail Insights. Identify and respond to unusual API activity. This is awesome. It automatically detects aberrant behavior. So now I can turn off my EC2 instance when I'm not using it. To turn it back on, I can spam API gateway with a bunch of bad requests. CloudTrail Insights will then notice this and fire off an event to its own S3 bucket. That event invokes a Lambda function that in turn turns my EC2 instance back on. This workflow is perfect. AWS Systems Manager Explorer. Not to be confused with Cost Explorer or Systems Manager Task Manager or anything else they might have named this, but it exists now. That's right. AWS Systems Manager Explorer, a multi-account, multi-region operations dashboard. First, congratulations to AWS on finally have something that works in multiple accounts and multiple regions at the same time. We've been waiting years for it. We knew you could do it. Secondly, there's a lot of cool stuff in Systems Manager. Please stop using the term Systems Manager as a brand. It doesn't work. I'm sorry. Relabel it. If you can relabel the original confusing name for EKS, you can relabel this one. CloudFormation update. There's now a CLI and third-party resource support and a registry. Now, first, the CLI is an open source project, which means finally we can shut up about it not supporting AWS services and go write it our damn selves, because doing volunteer work for $1 trillion company is what we want to do. Secondly, third-party resource support. Awesome. So let me get this straight. The service that doesn't support AWS services fully or at launch is now going to branch out and support third-party services. Sure, Jan. Sure. Improving containers by listening to customers. Great. Alternately, you can improve some customers by stuffing them into containers and then listening to them as it grows quieter. In the works, new AMD-powered, compute-optimized EC2 instances, C5A and C5AD. So, compute-optimized instances with AMD processors for less money. That's going to kick Intel right in the market share. Application Load Balancer simplifies deployment with weighted target groups. Awesome. So blue-green deploys are now something that ALBs can support for you. That's handy. You can now convert your single region Amazon DynamoDB tables to global tables, which is awesome. There is a billing caveat, though, that replicated units for writes are not covered by reserve capacity. So, understand that this may lead to a billing shock if you're not expecting that. They also cost slightly more. Be aware it's something you need to consider for when budgeting at scale. That said, it's a great enhancement that doesn't require you to rebuild your tables anymore. When you want to turn it on, you can just flip it on or flip it off. Huzzah. Or at least flip it on. Flip it off, yet to come, in theory. We'll see. New for Identity Federation, you can use employee attributes for access control in AWS. That's right, complicated identity management product grows far more complicated, and now your company barista has access to the payroll system. Whoopsie-doozy. There was a blog post welcoming everyone to AWS Storage Day. That was a bit of a surprise to me. My entire career is spent tracking everything AWS does, and somehow the fact they were having a storage day was not made aware to me until the morning of. Good work. They announced a bunch of storage dinguses. Let's go into it. There was an S3 replication update. Specifically, you can now have a replication SLA, which is awesome. You pay handsomely for it to the tune of 1.25 cents per gigabyte replicated in the primary regions, but that does unlock a way to guarantee how long it'll take objects to replicate. This means you can now meet contractual and regulatory requirements for those workloads that require it. That's kind of awesome, but probably not something you want to use as a default for most of your workloads. AWS Storage Gateway adds HA on VMware and new performance monitoring metrics. Yes, they also added increased performance for tape and file gateway. That's right. Storage Gateway is now a lot more acceptable for the enterprise work sets, and that's great because generally speaking, small scrappy startups are not using AWS Storage Gateway unless they're doing something a little bizarre. Amazon FSx for Windows File Server had some updates. It now supports multiple availability zones. It has some new enterprise-ready features, and that's great for enterprises. But on the other side of the spectrum, it also reduces the minimum file size for file systems down from 300 gigabytes to 32 gigabytes. That's moving down market and up market at the same time. Unfortunately, you're still on Windows. There's a guide on the AWS DevOps blog on how to migrate to code commit, code pipeline, and code build from GitLab. That's awesome. I wonder if I were to write a book on this, what part of the Dewey Decimal System would it go in? It'd need to be the section that focuses on how-to guides for things that nobody, absolutely nobody, is doing. If you're on GitHub or GitLab, you're not picking it all up and moving it to a variety of different AWS code services. No, I'm sorry, it's not happening. You can identify unused IAM roles and remove them confidently with the last used timestamp. First, I do everything confidently. It's usually wrong, but I look like I know exactly what I'm doing when I'm doing it. Secondly, you just know that deep within your cynical hearts, that AWS is only making it easy to remove unused IAM roles because they don't bill you for unused IAM roles. And lastly, at the end of this long slog, we come to a bit of a lighter side announcement. In the AWS Security Profile section on a blog, they profiled Dan Plastina, VP of Security Services. And in a, wait, what did I just read moment, Dan mentions that he keeps up on AWS service releases by reading the Last Week in AWS newsletter, which First is touching. Secondly, wow, he needs a better choice in reading material. And thirdly, wait, people actually read the things I write? I thought it was just like a journal that no one else could ever read. Uh-oh. And that's what happened last week in the world of AWS. Thank you for listening. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please leave it a 5-star review on iTunes. If you've hated it, please leave it a 5-star review on iTunes and send me a funny message on Twitter. I'm Corey Quinn, and I'll talk to you next week.
This has been a Humble Pod production. Stay humble.